Well, welcome everyone to another episode of Your Spiritual Journey. This is Dr. Bob Dove, and we're well into season 3 now. It's nice to have you with us. We hope you do support us. Just like us, subscribe, support us on Patreon, whatever suits your fancy. Make comments. Always enjoy getting comments that we can respond to. So today's guest is someone I've never met before. I just met her a couple of minutes ago, although we have talked on the phone. Christine McHenry grew up in the South Hills of Pittsburgh, and she and her family attended Southminster Presbyterian Church. She graduated from Mount Lebanon High School, earned a BA degree in biology from Hood College, which happens to be where my wife went to college, in Frederick, Maryland, and then got an MD degree from the University of Pittsburgh. She went on to train in pediatrics at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center, where she spent most of her medical career as a clinical pediatrician and coordinator of the Medical Ethics Program. She has a Master's of Arts in Theological Studies from United Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio, and is a trained spiritual director and supervisor. She attends Hyde Park Community United Methodist Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. So that's a brief background on Christine. Pretty soon you'll find out why she's got such a fascinating story. So Christine, I'm going to turn the mic over to you and ask you to start your story from the beginning, from young childhood to the present day, and then I may ask you some questions. All right?
Well, thank you, Bob. It's a pleasure being here with you today. As your introduction stipulated, I grew up in Pittsburgh in the South Hills, Mount Lebanon. I'm an only child. My parents and I attended Southminster Presbyterian Church, where I was active in the youth group and sang in the choir and all. I graduated Mount Lebanon High School and then on to Hood College, where I met Amy. We were in the same class and just celebrated our 50th reunion. Hard to believe, but 50 years since we graduated college. And majored in biology while I was at Hood, and went from there to Pitt to get an MD degree. My dad was a practicing pediatrician for many years, 35, 40 years in the South Hills. And I followed his footsteps in terms of going into pediatrics and came to Cincinnati to do my training. So I trained in pediatrics and was chief resident for a year. And after that process, I felt somewhat dehumanized and wondered what I had just spent the last 8 years of my life doing, becoming a person that I didn't really like anymore. And so I started on a quest and started taking theology classes, first at Xavier University here in Cincinnati, and then ultimately at United Theological in Dayton, Ohio, where I got my master's degree. And after residency, I spent about 6 years in private practice, but then I enjoyed the variety of things at the medical center, the teaching, seeing patients, and so on. And so I went back to the medical center and then spent the rest of my career there.
So is that when you first got on the ethics committee and got involved in that after getting your master's degree?
Well, I was in the process of getting my master's, but about a year after I went back to the medical center on faculty, an opportunity came up at the University of Chicago to train in clinical medical ethics. And I remember vividly sitting in that faculty meeting when Bill Schubert, who was the chair of the department, made the announcement that uh, University of Chicago was looking for applicants. And it was as if I was the only one in the room. It was as if that message was coming directly to me. And I knew at that point I was to apply for this program. And I did, and spent a year in Chicago training with Mark Sigler at the Center for Clinical Medical Ethics, and then came back to Children's to run the program.
So
but all along working on my master's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could you describe perhaps some of the ethical situations that you got engaged in, and what kinds of decisions needed to be made?
Mm-hmm. Well, as you can imagine, a number of them had to deal with end-of-life issues, whether to withdraw life support or to embark on a new regimen of therapy. I always made it clear to those that consulted us that we don't make decisions for you. We help you look at the entirety of the issue and give you some suggestions, but any final decisions are made in that doctor-patient relationship or between the family and the physicians. So we make recommendations in a number of end-of-life cases, transplant cases, nutrition and hydration was an issue back then, whether to begin artificial nutrition and hydration.
Sure. Yeah. I guess I always wondered about that decision to do no harm, which all physicians, I guess that's part of the Hippocratic Oath. What you consider doing harm, when sometimes it's better to let a person go than to continue life support.
Mm-hmm.
And is there a specific, I don't know, I guess in your consultations with physicians around those issues, is there a specific way that you would interpret that for them? Or I don't know, how would you help them, I guess, make those kinds of decisions?
Well, when you think about it, we as physicians often inflict harm, if you will, short-term harm for long-term gain. In other words, it's not meant to be an ongoing harm, if you will. So the question becomes benefits versus risks. And, a lot has to do with what, if you're talking about a young child who can't express opinions for him or herself, what are the values of the family? What would they like to see for their child? Mm-hmm. And if you have a child who's older, say 12 or 13 or above, who's able to express preferences, it's important to elicit their preferences as well.
Yeah.
So making sure all relevant parties are heard was a big part of what we did. And when I say relevant parties, I mean not only the patient and family members and the physicians, but the bedside nurse. Or the respiratory technologist. All these folks have an agency in this, have feelings and opinions as to what they think is an appropriate course of action. And it's important to allow them to voice that.
Yeah. Yeah, I never thought of the caregivers having agency in the situation. Oh. Okay, didn't mean to interrupt you, but I'm just kind of fascinated by, okay, what does a medical ethicist do, and how do they carry out their duties? Okay.
Well, and of course, there are many ways of doing medical ethics in a medical center. Sometimes there is a single consultant that runs the program, if you will. In other programs, like the one I was involved with, I chaired the bioethics committee. So I had a committee of trained individuals in bioethics who would help do the consultations. And that was always helpful too, in terms of getting feedback from other colleagues in terms of what recommendations we would be making.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so I interrupted your story there, but
it's all right.
Since I've already got you interrupted, I want to consider going back to childhood and your spiritual journey. Typically, we go through as people, as we mature, we go through changes in our perspective on spirituality or the religion that we're being raised in. Often as teenagers, we reject it just because we're in that stage of our lives where we want to reject everything that has to do with our parents and then create ourselves anew. So could you describe that part of your journey, just saying going through the teenage years and becoming an adult, and spiritually where you were at that point?
Well, I think my rebellion, if you want to call it that, probably happened in medical school. So maybe it was a little delayed. Throughout my childhood and college years and so on, I was very involved in church and church activities. When I was at Hood, I chaired the chapel committee. So worked with the chaplains, with Chaplain Smith, and for Sunday morning worship and other programs. So I don't think I really, maybe a seed was planted when I was at Hood, when a theology professor raised the question, would it make a difference to you if Jesus's body was stolen and he wasn't resurrected from the dead? That probably, I would say that was probably the first questioning of my religious upbringing, if you will.
An interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
I won't ask you how you answered it.
Okay, good.
But it is a good question, sure.
Yeah.
Food for thought. Okay, so I'll stop interrupting you and let you go on.
Well, let's see. Okay, so I'm at the medical center, as on faculty at the medical center. And things were changing pretty rapidly in medicine. It was becoming much more corporate, much more a business. For me, it was losing some of the family feel that I had when I was a resident. And I was getting somewhat disgruntled by the politics. And so I had, when I was at Children's, I was involved for many, many years with the clinical pastoral education program and knew the chaplains there quite well. I had heard them talk about spiritual direction, and I thought, well, what is this spiritual direction? How does this differ from going to a counselor or a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist? And so I was intrigued and asked for a recommendation. Did they have someone they could recommend to me? So that began my quest in terms of spiritual direction. I found a lovely woman. This was in June of 2004. And I would say that that was, though, back when I had finished residency and felt dehumanized and wondered what I had been doing for the last 8 years of my life, that was kind of the inkling, the beginning of my quest and my second half of life, if you want to put it as Richard Rohr says. But it really took off when I started seeing a spiritual director in 2004. Yeah. That is really a key moment for me when, I was somewhat at my wit's end and said, why am I even here? What's life all about?
Yeah. So this spiritual director, and I know this because I asked you this question on the phone, was not a Presbyterian.
No.
And so you're engaged with somebody who has a totally different religious background than you. So how did that work for you? Were there some conflicts in beliefs or thoughts, or were you just totally open to her and what she had to say?
Well, let me first say that spiritual direction has been around for centuries, and it's been predominantly within our Catholic brothers and sisters that we find spiritual direction. But over the last 20, 30 years, many of the other religious traditions, Christian and otherwise, have also embarked on this ministry of spiritual direction. And when we sit with someone in spiritual direction, we hope to create a safe and welcoming space where, in a confidential space, where the person can feel free and open to be who he or she is. And a big part of what we do in spiritual direction is listen to the sacred story of the other. So in terms of your question, Bob, of finding, were there some areas of conflict, if you will, because my spiritual direction is Catholic and I'm Protestant? I have not found that at all. Not at all.
Because you dropped the name of Richard Rohr, who, of course, comes from the Catholic tradition also.
Right.
And since you dropped his name, are there any particular works that he published? I guess when you mentioned his name, you did mention his second half of life stories.
Right.
But is there anything in particular that draws you to him, or is it his current action and contemplation group?
I've received Father Richard's daily meditations for many years now, probably since 2004. And the one thing that struck me right off the bat was he was able to give voice to things, to concepts that I intuitively knew, but wasn't able to put into words.
Okay.
wasn't able to express. So his daily meditations have been very powerful for me, along as with his other writings like Falling Upward and Immortal Diamond and Universal Christ and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, I get his daily meditations, but not as far back as you've been getting them, just for the past couple years.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Uh, so where are we at this point? Okay, you're still in the medical profession.
I'm still in the medical profession. I have just started spiritual direction myself. And what I found over the course of a number of months was that uh, with a regular prayer practice, a regular quiet time, doing some spiritual reading, God was really just filling me with insight after another, so quickly that I didn't really have an opportunity to slow down and savor any one. They were just coming rapid fire, whether it was about my belovedness, that I'm a beloved child of God, or that God cares about everything, large things and small things. God cares about everything. We're all interconnected. The promise of being with us always. So, I mean, there were just insight after insight after insight. And that became significant to me as I was trying to discern what to do in terms of my medical career, whether to stay at the medical center or maybe leave and go out in private practice or do something totally different. But it also became important to me when, starting in the summer of 2005, I went through a difficult, almost 2-year period of losing 4 family members, both my parents included, and someone very close to me who was like a second father. So 5 people. And what was interesting as I look back on that time, I had this rapid fire experience of insight after another. And as soon as this period of grief began, it's not that the insights totally stopped, but they slowed down significantly. And I view that prior to that period of grief, as a period of preparation. As I'm not so sure how I would have made it through those 2 years or 18 months to 2 years had it not been for some of the things that I knew that God had placed on my heart.
Yeah. So, if I may ask, could you specify a couple of those things that helped you get through the grief?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the one thing is the idea that I'm not alone. God is always with me. God is surrounding me and within me, and closer to me than my next breath. So, that certainly gave me comfort. It also, as you well imagine, going through a period of grief like that puts things in perspective for you. What's really important in life. The things that I had been so concerned about before just seem to be insignificant now.
Yeah. So that terminology, God is in me. how do you experience that?
Mhm. Well, we mentioned Richard Rohr and another theologian, well, two other theologians who have been very helpful, if you will, in my spiritual journey, Henry Nouwen and John Philip Newell. And all three, in their own way, talk, as well as the Gospels and the letters, talk about the indwelling Christ, God within you. And the way I experience it is a peace that goes beyond anything external, meaning all these external things are just rough waters, but there's a peace within that resides and is calm and is assured. And so that's how I experience that indwelling.
Okay. Do you call that something? Like some people call that the Holy Spirit. Some people call it, the soul spirit or the soul. So do you have a particular reference for that?
Well, I tend to think of it as soul, as my soul, the place of my true self. Again, Richard Rohr terminology, but a place where my true self resides, where I am one with God and God is one with me, and we are one with the entire created order.
Okay. So that leads to another question, because I'm a student of oneness, which was a book that came through Russia, and that sense of oneness. Then, when you say we are one with everything and everybody, is there a way that you experience that? For instance, just to say, okay, you and I, we are one with each other. What does that mean?
Well, I can tell you of a couple of really profound experiences I've had.
Okay.
In my journey, I participated in what's called the Academy for Spiritual Formation, which is a 2-year program through the upper room of the United Methodist Church. And we would go on retreats quarterly. We looked at issues such as spiritual practices, spiritual disciplines, prayer practices, spirituality across the Christian traditions, and on and on. But I had an experience on one of the retreats. Early in the morning, I was walking the retreat ground, and I was just walking on the retreat ground and talking with God. And there was a tree up to my right. And all of a sudden, I became one with the tree. Everything else kind of faded away, and I and the tree became one. And we became one with everything else. There was no separation. And I had another similar experience too when I was in my spiritual direction training, where I had that sense of oneness when I was taking a contemplative walk, that nothing separated me from the grass that was growing around me. So, I mean, those times are few and far between, as you can well imagine. But they're powerful when they do occur.
Yeah, I can hear it. I can hear that energy from you,
Mm-hmm.
the power of that moment. Uh, I've participated in some forest bathing experiences, and I've come close to that, but that's
Uh-huh.
uh, I I can picture that moment for you. Okay, I'm assuming then that you have an appreciation for nature and trees and the grass, and do you make that part of a daily routine, or at least a weekly routine, or a way to continuously experience that?
Well, there's no doubt the Holy has spoken to me through trees in some wonderful ways over the years, and so I still enjoy looking at at the trees, and not just looking at them, gazing at them in a contemplative gaze. Um, and I have a number of plants. I'm a kind of a plant mama. Have a lot of plants in the house and a few outside. I have a room that I call my joy room, which is a four-season room, all glass, that looks out into the back with the trees and the bird feeders and the yeah. So I have a great joy in seeing all the different backyard birds that come by,
Yeah.
and the barred owl that occasionally gives us a visit.
Okay. In our discussion on the phone, you mentioned something about enneagrams and labyrinths.
Mhm.
So, uh, could you expound on your experience with enneagrams and why you even got involved in that, and what that's meant for you?
Well, I guess maybe before we get to that part of the journey,
Okay.
one other piece I would like to mention is that through the discernment process I embarked on with my spiritual director, I ultimately decided that I was being called to leave medicine. And I remember very clearly the morning that that happened. It was in November 2007. And I was doing my quiet time and reading a passage in the Hebrew scripture about rebuilding the temple. And it was clear as day that I was to leave medicine and rebuild my temple. And I said, well, Lord, you know, I have responsibilities until the end of the academic year. I'm responsible for this, 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 and this. Yes, I want you to retire in June. Are you sure about this? Yes, I want you to retire in June. And I went in that day to work and told my boss I was retiring in June. I had 100% peace about that decision. There was no question in my mind that that was what I was to do. Even though I didn't know what I was being called to, I knew I was being called from medicine to something else. And so I did retire in June of 2008, still not knowing what I was being called to. And then in October of 2008, very surprisingly, I was diagnosed with leukemia. So again, I see the hand of God in all this, in that had I not retired when I did, on my own terms, if you will, with this new diagnosis, I don't know how much longer I would have been able to stay in clinical practice anyway. And so, as you can well imagine, my spiritual journey and my spiritual life really supported me throughout and continues to support me throughout this journey. I mean, there were questions of bone marrow transplant, and because I had a rare form of leukemia, and but bottom line is I have been able to get into remission just with oral chemotherapy and with few side effects, and able to do most everything I want to do.
Well, you look terrific. I would never ascertain that you're not in the peak of health.
No, thank you.
There's, I guess, often for people in the medical profession and in the sciences in general, a conflict between spirituality and a purely scientific path. Did you ever feel that conflict, or maybe in the beginning of this journey, and this thought that there had to be something more than what your life was dedicated to?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly in my medical training, we very rarely talked about the spiritual life of a patient or family. It would only come up if there was a conflict from the standpoint of a family refusing treatment that the medical team thought was necessary. But, over the decades, I think more and more people are realizing the importance of spirituality in general and spirituality of the patient, and how supportive that can be when they're going through difficult times, and, the values that brings to the situation. So when I was diagnosed in 2008, I happened to be referred to a local oncologist who was a woman of faith, and that was very helpful at the time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, I'm going to get back to Enneagrams now.
Okay. Oh, yes. Enneagram. So.
What was the role?
Shortly after I was diagnosed with leukemia, my spiritual director gave me a pamphlet about training in spiritual direction. It was a 3-year training program. And I said, Julie, I don't know what tomorrow will bring. How can I commit to 3 years? And she said, just be open and honest with them when you apply. And so I prayed about it, and I said, okay, Lord, if you want me to do this, the words will come easily as I write out this application. Well, the words came very easily. Then I said, okay, Lord, if you really want me to do this, I'll be granted an interview. Well, I was granted an interview. And I said, okay, Lord, if you really want me to do this, I'll be accepted. And I was accepted. And then our first retreat, the first year of the program, we spent the day talking about contemplation. And what was contemplation? What did it look like? What did it feel like? And then we were asked to go out on the retreat grounds and find a tree and contemplate a tree. Well, as I mentioned, the Lord had spoken to me through trees so profoundly over the years that I said, I hear you, Lord, I'm supposed to be here. So I embarked on a 3-year training program, and it was within that program that I was introduced to the Enneagram, and subsequently have done some more work with it. And what I have found is that it has been a very profound tool for self-understanding, knowing that I'm a 1 on the Enneagram, knowing what that means, knowing how I can get hooked by certain things and then not act as lovingly or kindly as I might want to act. And being aware of that, then when I do get hooked, I can say, no, wait a minute. I don't have to act out of my same pattern. I can choose to act differently. And so it is a wonderful tool for getting to know yourself. Yeah.
You're just saying those words, I can choose to act differently. There's a pretty well-known study called A Course in Miracles. And that's one of the basic tenets of that course, that we have a choice. And we often just act out of reaction, or act out of habit, or act out of conditioning.
Right.
And we don't think we have a choice, but every moment, every decision, we have a choice. And that just reminded me of that. So could you explain a little bit for our audience members who don't know what an Enneagram is, as to how that works?
Well, it's there are 9 personality types and 3 subtypes of each of the 9 personality types, and we all have aspects of all 9 of those types within us, but there is one type where we call home. And so I mentioned I'm a 1, that a 1 is usually associated with perfectionism, wanting to be right, and all the numbers are associated with a different type of personality. So, without going into a lot of detail, there are a couple different schools of thought on the Enneagram. Well, I've trained in what's called the narrative Enneagram program through Helen Palmer, and where basically we learn about what it means to be a 1 or a 9 or a 6 by hearing the stories of those who experience that, who experience being a 6. What is that like for you in this circumstance? And then there's another school where it's not as narrative as the Helen Palmer school. It's more, well, this is the way it is. These are the characteristics and so on.
Well, thank you for that education. That's helpful. The other piece that I heard on the phone from you, where I made a note, was that you've also experienced a labyrinth, and that had some meaning for you. Could you tell that story?
Well, prayer labyrinths are found in many, many, many faith traditions. And actually, the oldest one that has been found is about from 3000 BCE. It became particularly important during the Middle Ages. Up until that time, it was fairly common for Christians to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Well, then in the Middle Ages, things became much more difficult to be able to do that with the Inquisitions and so on. And so various cathedrals in Europe built labyrinths. Now, a labyrinth is different than a maze. For a labyrinth, there is one entrance in and one entrance out. A maze, you might have several entrances, and a maze really is meant to confuse you and confound you. It's like a puzzle. You're trying to figure your way to the center or how to get out. But the labyrinth, there is one entrance, and you trust that if you follow the path, that path will lead you to the center. And the idea is that as you prepare yourself walking into the center, you try to release the concerns of the day and open yourself up to receive what God has for you as you enter the center. And then in the center, you stay as long as you wish and just be open to the presence of God. And then on the way out, whatever is, you walk the path back out to the entrance again and take whatever you have received back out into the world. Now, there's not a right way or a wrong way really to walk the labyrinth. And I always tell people that whatever you experience on the labyrinth, be open to it. Use everything you might see, you might hear as you're walking the labyrinth, you might think as you're walking the labyrinth as a metaphor for your spiritual journey. And so these labyrinths at these cathedral sites in Europe became pilgrimage sites and became a way for pilgrims to walk to the holy city of Jerusalem in the center of the labyrinth and then return to the world.
Okay. Great history of labyrinths. I learned some new things in there, and I thought I knew all there was to know about labyrinths. That's great. Always learning some new things. Just to wrap up, you are currently at a Methodist church.
Yes.
And what is your role there, and what are you up to?
Well, I completed my training as a spiritual director, and so I do spiritual direction through the church, one-on-one. And in spiritual direction, as I mentioned before, we create a safe, welcoming, confidential environment where people hopefully feel free to be themselves. And we accompany another on their spiritual journey. Many people don't like the term director. They rather use the word companion, so a spiritual companion along the way. And we start at a very different place than a counselor might or a psychiatrist might. We start from the place of knowing that God's wisdom lies within, and that the person sitting across from us is a beloved child of God. And the true director of this journey is the Holy Spirit. And so we listen to the person's sacred story. I mean, God is present in all that we experience, whether we recognize it or not. God is present in all human beings, all of creation. And hopefully we allow that person to be able to see where God has been at work in their life, where they might have missed it before. Become more open and alert and awake to the presence of God around them. So I do spiritual direction through the church. I'm involved in the prayer shawl ministry. And I'll put a plug in for our prayer shawl ministry, which we started back in 2006 and have had the blessing, the privilege of presenting over 850 shawls.
Wow.
To folks, and have gone internationally to our sister church in Samara, Russia, and to Germany and Haiti and Colombia and Mexico and all. Yeah. And I've done a number, I've taught a number of classes, contemplative classes through the church, liturgist on Sunday morning. So I've been involved.
You keep busy. Well, at this point in the podcast, I always ask the guest for any final words of wisdom, and you've already given us quite a few. So I don't know if you have any left, but I'm going to turn it over to you to just leave our audience with any words that you would like to leave them with.
Well, my hope and my prayer is that we all know our belovedness. We all know that we are good. We all know that we are interconnected, not only to one another, but to all creation. And that the source of all life is with us always, no matter where we are or what the circumstance might be. We're never alone.
Okay. So, audience, as always, consider what you've heard today and take what resonates with you and just discard the rest, or at least save it for later. Until next time, this has been your spiritual journey.